Paul's letter to the Philippians is one of the real gems of Paul's letters. It's probably one of the most relaxed of his epistles. Paul has this reputation for writing to people when they've particularly annoyed him, whereas Philippians stands out alongside 1 Thessalonians as being one of those epistles where he really isn't particularly annoyed with the Philippian community. He is actually very, very proud of them, very pleased with them, and is writing to thank them. Of course, there are a few things that he wants to correct. It's a 2.5 cheers kind of epistle, but much, much better than epistles like the epistle to the Galatians, where Paul is really needing to write to correct various bits of their doctrine. So the epistle to the Philippians is a fascinating read. And it's fascinating because in it you get a different Paul than you find elsewhere, a much more relaxed and engaging Paul. But in it, you also get that sense of Paul's personal relationship with this particular community. And it's that personal relationship that gives the epistle to the Philippians its particular flavour, its particular character, and makes it, in my view, really quite such an attractive epistle to read. A feature about Philippians, which actually does make it a really intriguing epistle, is that possibly more than any of the other epistles, you get a sense of what's going on in Paul's life and what's going on in the life of the Philippians. Because the letter comes from a very particular context, a very particular time in Paul's life, which makes it striking and significant. Paul is writing to the Philippians from prison. And the Philippians have heard of Paul's imprisonment and sent one of their number, Epaphroditus, to Paul with a message and a gift. And Paul is writing back to thank them for the message and the gift. But what you get in the epistle is a really interesting insight into how much he really cares for this community and actually, therefore, for all of the communities that he founded. Because Epaphroditus came to Paul in prison and became very, very ill indeed. Paul doesn't say why he became ill, whether he caught something, whether something happened to him, but he had a life-threatening illness, and it was thought that he might even die. Epaphroditus has now recovered from the illness, and Paul is sending him back with a responding message. So what you get is a Paul who is deeply moved. He's deeply moved by the kindness of the Philippians in sending him the message and the gift in the first place. He's deeply moved by Epaphroditus, who was prepared to put his life on the line to bring the message and the gift. And out of both of those, you get this letter written. And this seems to be, to me, to be the important lens through which we understand the Philippian letter. It is a letter of thanksgiving. It is a letter in which we can understand something about who Paul really sees himself to be and what he sees as the importance of his ministry. Because as well as that element of autobiography, the autobiography of the Philippian community, we also get an element of the autobiography of Paul. I've mentioned already that Paul is in prison, and clearly this has shaken the Philippians, and their message to him seems to have come out of the fact that they are unnerved by the fact that he is in prison. And it raises the whole question of success criteria for the early Christians, which is one that still resonates for us today. The Philippians have understood that because Paul is in prison, he has effectively failed as an apostle. If he hadn't failed, he wouldn't be in prison. And a large part of the epistle is Paul reminding the Philippians that actually in Christ, different principles are in play. That actually success in Christ looks very different than success anywhere else in any other walk in life. So actually, Paul is successful despite being in prison. And success boils down to simply this, the proclamation of Christ. Where Christ is proclaimed, where who Christ was and what he has done for us can be proclaimed, then there is always success, no matter what it looks like and where you find it. For Paul, in this particular context, the success is that he's able to proclaim the good news of Christ to the imperial guard. So therefore Christ is still proclaimed, therefore there is no failure to be found in what Paul is experiencing at the moment. And it's this that is the centre for what Paul is trying to say to the Philippians in the whole of the letter. Philippi is an important colony within the Roman Empire, let alone within the early Christian community. Philippi, the city, is named after Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon is Alexander the Great's father, and he was attracted to that particular area because of the mines there, particularly the gold mines. It was a very lucrative area. And although there was a community there already, he settled in that particular area and founded a city, which, as so many people did in those days, he named after himself. That's why it's called Philippi, after Philip of Macedon. And even in the time of Paul, they are still an important community because of the mines and because of the trading route that you discover at that particular area. So Philippi is a very key city in that particular part of Greece. Within the Pauline churches, it's even more important because the Philippian Christian community is the first European Christian community that we find recorded in the pages of Acts. So Paul is in Asia Minor, in a place called Troas, and he is unsure where to go, and he has a dream, and a man from Macedon appears to him in the dream and says, "Come over here." The place that he goes to, according to Acts first, is Philippi. It is, of course, possible that he went to other places earlier, but Acts doesn't record that. So Philippi is the first place that is recorded in Acts that Paul creates a Christian community in Europe. And that therefore makes it a remarkably significant community from the perspective of early Christian history. It's also important because it reveals something about how Paul began his evangelism when he arrived for the first time in a new place. And what he did was he looked for a Jewish community. One of the things that he seems to have done regularly is wherever he went within the Roman Empire, he began first with a Jewish community and then moved outwards. What's intriguing is that they clearly don't have a synagogue because there wasn't a building to go to. So he went looking for Jews who might have been praying at that particular point. And he found them just outside the walls of the city by the river. And that is the context in which he began to preach to Lydia and then outwards to other people. So you get, therefore, some really important insights into Paul and how he did his evangelism in those early years. He would arrive in a city. He would look for a community that he could make an immediate connection with. He would spend time with that community before moving outwards. And it's those kind of images that actually help give us something quite important to understand about the nature of Paul's ministry and how he went about doing things. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that the Philippian community is so close to Paul's heart. Not only do they love him and send him messages of support in prison, but they are the very first community that Paul founded from the perspective of Christianity in Europe, and therefore that makes them a very significant community indeed. One of the things we know about Paul when he's writing the letter to the Philippians is that he's in prison. You might think that this would help us tie the dating down really quite straightforwardly, that he's in prison here at a certain point, and therefore we can date Philippians very easily. The problem is that Paul doesn't say where he's in prison, and this causes all sorts of difficulties in terms of trying to date the letter. There are two major periods of imprisonment that we know of from the book of Acts. The first is when Paul was in prison in Caesarea, which is in the late 50s, and the second is when he was in prison in Rome in the early 60s. Now, in the letter to the Philippians, Paul makes reference to the imperial guard, and so a large number of scholars, many scholars indeed, would identify Paul as being in prison either in Caesarea or in Rome. In fact, the majority would plump with Rome as the date, which would make that an early 60s date. However, there are some scholars, and in fact an increasing number of late, who would identify a different period of imprisonment for Paul, and that would be a period of imprisonment in Ephesus. Now, there are problems with this, not least because there is very little evidence for Paul being in prison in Ephesus from Acts. There are just vague hints that you find in various bits of Paul's letters. Hints in 1 and 2 Corinthians in particular suggest that Paul in fact had been in prison in Ephesus. If that were the case, then he would have been in prison in the mid-50s or even early to mid-50s, and that therefore pulls the date of Philippians much, much earlier. It raises questions about the connection with the imperial guard, but actually one of the things that we do know about the imperial guard is that they are loosely connected to the guarding of Caesar.